So we're continuing on with our discussion of port security. We've just talked about the switchport port security MAC address and the switchport port security maximum commands. Now let's loop back and talk about that first command you see up there, which is aging. So if we do switchport port security aging, you'll see that we have three options. We have static, which is to enable aging for configured secure addresses, and then we have the time period, which is how many minutes or seconds, and then we have the type. So we'll look at the type first off. So we'll look at type. We have two types of aging. We have absolute and inactivity. Now the default is absolute, meaning that after X number of minutes, clear the table and look again. You can also switch that to inactivity, which bases it upon the activity of the port. If you haven't seen any traffic from this MAC address for X number of minutes, then clear that MAC address from the secure table and allow another MAC address to take its place. Absolute is the default, and it generally works the best for the situations you'll need port security aging turned on. So we'll look back at the time, and it is the aging time in minutes between 1 and 1440. Don't know why you'd ever want to set it as high as 1440. Most installations use a timer of about 5 minutes or so. So now you might be asking yourself, well, I've set my secure addresses, I've set the aging type, I have set the number of secure MAC addresses allowed on a port. What happens if one of those parameters is breached? What happens if I have the maximum number of MAC addresses set to 2, someone plugs that third MAC address in, that third PC or whatever, into the switch port? What happens then? Well, that is the switchport port security violation. And there are three types of violation modes. You have protect, restrict, and shutdown. Now, shutdown is pretty straightforward. If you violate the port security settings for this particular switch port, just shut down the entire port. Don't let any traffic through this port until you go in and re-enable it, or there are some commands you can set to automatically recover, but we don't cover those at the CCENT level. Protect and restrict have pretty much the same effect on the traffic. Both of them will just simply ignore the offending MAC addresses. For example, if you have the maximum MAC addresses set to 2 and you plug in a third device into that switch port, it'll just simply ignore traffic from that third MAC address. The key difference between protect and restrict is that protect simply ignores the traffic silently. Restrict will log it into the system log and send an SNMP trap. So if you have a piece of network management software like SolarWinds or NetVoyant or Unicenter, you can configure that software to look for the traps from your switches about port security violations and sound the alarm, send an email, whatever you want to do based upon the receipt of that trap. If you don't really care and you just want to protect it, say it's at a branch someplace and you just want to make sure that no one plugs in another hub into your network, you can just set it to protect. And generally what will happen is once people actually violate the port security settings, they'll call you and say, hey, I plugged in this hub and no one can connect. Well, you're not supposed to plug that hub in. That's why no one can connect. The system is working as designed. Now, I'll close out the discussion of port security with a little note that I probably should have mentioned up when we talked about MAC address security, but I wanted to kind of separate this out because it's something that not a lot of people grasp, and I have actually seen exam questions regarding this particular statement. If you use the switchport port security MAC address sticky command to tell the switch to just learn the addresses on the fly, the addresses that the switch learns are not added to the startup configuration. They're obviously added to the running configuration, and if you were to do show run after issuing this command, you would actually see them entered in the interface configuration. However, unless you write that configuration, then all those changes are lost if the switch is rebooted. So you can really think of sticky kind of as a learning mode. You tell the switch to learn the MAC addresses that are connected to it, you let it run for a day or so, then you go and look at the running config, and if it looks good to you, then you can write that config to the startup configuration, and then the switch will remember those MAC addresses the next time it boots up. And that pretty much covers switch port security, and that concludes our discussion of switch port security.